Oh, I see. It's right here. Good morning. For those of you who are already on the line, we're going to get started probably in about 3 or 4 minutes. We'll leave just a little bit of time for people who will be joining late. Welcome to those who are just joining. We'll start the webinar in about 3 minutes. We'll give a little bit of time for people to connect in. See you in here momentarily. So we'll start in about 2 minutes. We'll start in 1 minute here. We're just watching the number of people joining, and when it levels off, we'll get started. Hey, good morning to everybody. Welcome to this webinar hosted by InterVISTAS. We want to take you through some of the key elements of the Canada Transportation Act Review Report that Minister Garneau tabled yesterday. During the webinar here, I'm going to, it's not advancing, sorry. Sorry, just give us a moment here. Okay, so the way the webinar is going to work is We have everybody on mute except for myself as speaker. That'll hopefully minimize the background noise. For those of you who are connected through the internet to the webinar, you should be able to see on your screens the slides that I'm using. And if you are not seeing them, or if you're participating by phone, you can go to the InterVISTAS website, www.intervistas.com, and we've got a place on the website where we have a link for our webinars. You just go there and you can actually download our slides. On the screen here as well, it indicates where to download the slides. You'll probably be able to see me in the lower left-hand corner here. The format of the presentation today is I'll do an initial presentation with my colleague Solomon Wong and Deborah Ward. We will then have a set of questions. The way we like to do questions in webinars is if you have a question, we'd ask that you send it to us by email. So you send an email to us at info@intervistas.com, and then we will receive it, and then we will go through the questions at the end. And if we have time, we will also just unmute and take any questions through the audio as well. Let's see. The webinar is going to focus on a high-level review on selected topics. The report itself runs to 511 pages. There's 2 volumes. There are 58 primary recommendations and 150 sub-recommendations, and we're not going to be able to cover all of that in an hour. So we're going to focus on a few areas. We're specifically not focusing on rail issues. That's it's about half of the content of the report. We're going to focus this morning on airport governance, global hub and facilitation issues, airline access, air navigation and control. We'll talk about passenger ferry transport. You'll find that's going to be very brief. And on marine transport, you're going to find that some of the recommendations on airport governance are going to be similar to some of the recommendations on marine transport. So let me get started here. So on the left of the screen, this is the cover then of Volume 1 of the report. Volume 1 is the main report. There's a Volume 2, which is labeled as appendices, but our view is that the appendices really are part of the main report. A lot of the discussion is actually in the appendices. It's not simply a set of tables. It's where there's a key discussion, for example, on potential for-profit private airport governance model. You'll find the most important content there is actually in the appendices. On the lower right of the screen, we got the link at Transport Canada where you can actually download the main report and the appendices. Now, before I move on, I just want to provide a general comment. Dr. Emerson and his panel have some recommendations in here that are actually fairly radical. I've already hinted at the fact that he's opening the possibility of a for-profit governance model for airports and ports. This is a very radical change versus the not-for-profit local airport authority governance model we have in Canada. We're actually not surprised by some of the radical changes that Dr. Emerson and his panel have recommended. We point out that Dr. Emerson was actually the first local airport authority president in Canada, Vancouver Airport, although Calgary was transferred either an hour before or an hour after, depending on who you talk to. But at that time, for those of us who were around then, the deputy minister actually represented the local airport and later Canadian Airport Authority governance model is a transitional model that may eventually go to full privatization, and I think David Emerson has remembered that. David Emerson, of course, is a professional economist. He's got a PhD in economics, and many professional economists tend to prefer for-profit, private sector solutions, and I think that's being reflected in here. You're also going to find that there's a very strong focus in the report on transportation as a critical piece of a broader agenda around trade. And this reflects Dr. Emerson's background as a former Minister of Trade here in Canada. So a lot of the recommendations and the approach he's taken actually are not particularly surprising to us, and we'd be happy to answer any questions on that that come up at the end. Now, let me get into the key points. First, I think it's important to recognize this is not the end. This is step one of three. There could be even more steps for this. This review was required by legislation, but the minister at the time, Minister Rayott, accelerated the review. The review probably would have started in 2015 or even this year, 2016. But because of a crisis in the grain transportation system during 2013, where we had Canada's all-time record grain crop, at the same time that in the winter we had an Arctic vortex, which actually reduces rail capacity because trains have to go slower and the trains have to be shorter in extreme cold. So the review is statutorily required, and step one is the review panel's report as chaired by David Emerson. Now, the second step, Minister Garneau actually talked about very briefly yesterday. And I've got a quote here. He said, he said this in question period. What we're going to do is present to Canadians about 300 important stakeholders what their opinion is, how, and then we'll make decisions later on this year. That's interesting. He's saying this year, 2016, on how to go forward with Canada's national transportation system. We note that in the previous review, that review came out in 2001. That document is called Vision and Balance, and it was followed almost 2 years later by the minister's response in a document called Straight Ahead. And then the legislation came several years after that, and that would be step three. So what was tabled yesterday is just the first step of what's probably going to be a multi-year step. Now, I'm actually going to go back a slide just to go back to the title. The title of the report is Pathways, Connecting Canada's Transportation System to the World. And this reflects a key theme in this report, which is it's about connectivity, and it's connectivity to the globe as opposed to domestic connectivity. So the theme of this report, he wanted to take a 30-year perspective, and he did that by looking back 30 years, and then his recommendations are what we need, maybe not this year or next year, but things that we're going to need in roughly a 30-year period. He said that Canada's transportation system has been fundamentally and successfully transformed. So that's interesting. He's basically saying what's been done in the past few decades has been successful. The achievements are renewed infrastructure, improved operational efficiency, greater profits for carriers and for shippers, more choice, and lower prices for transportation access. How is it done? Well, he indicated that it was done in part by commercialization and privatization. Now, the airports and ports weren't privatized, but Air Canada, CN, for example, were. The divestiture of assets to Ports, Airports Authority, NAV Canada, and so forth. Deregulation of the transportation sector. Liberalization of international trade. So now that's not transport per se, but it's a broader liberalization globally. And he points out reliance on competition and market forces. And I've got an arrow there pointing out that this review recommends continued reliance on competition and market forces to meet Canada's trade and connectivity objectives. The next theme is transportation is not a sector to be worshipped in its own right. Transportation is simply a centerpiece for a long-term economic policy for Canada. What Canada needs, he says, is the performance of the transportation system underpins the country's trade performance, the performance of the economy, and the health and sustainability of communities. You can see there's really strong emphasis around transportation facilitating the economy. This report has a supply chain perspective, and this will be a major change for both Transport Canada and the Canadian Transportation Agency. His key recommendations are to try and move them away from a transportation mode frame of mind into a supply chain and broader logistics orientation, including mandates that the agency has, the type of data that Transport Canada and the agency collects, and so forth. Now, this is a key theme next on the third bullet, where we are today. He says we are lagging behind our competitors. The one exception has been air transport infrastructure. And therefore, there's a need, in spite of being successful over the last 30 years, what we need to be successful in coming in 20 to 30 years needs some fairly radical change. And that's because while we've made a lot of progress, we are falling behind in recent years. How are we going to do this? Well, the terms he uses shift to a performance and evidence-based framework on transportation and logistics. So we've got a framework on transportation and logistics. He talks about creating a center of excellence for transportation and logistics and moving to a much more quantitative approach with a lot more data being in the system, performance and evidence-based. Another major theme, though, on how he proposes to do this is to rely more on private sector funding than just debt markets. He is embracing equity capital as a potential framework for how we make the changes. Now, let me get to the first substantial topic, which is airport governance. My guess is that on the aviation side, this is probably the one area that's given the most heartburn to stakeholders yesterday and sleepless night last night because some of the changes are dramatic. But first, this slide I actually find really interesting. So here's some really neat information in the report. What he's doing is he's comparing at the top of this chart government revenues from the air sector for fiscal year 2014. So there's the roughly $300 million in airport rent, $660 million in ATSC revenues, $100 million in fuel tax for a grand total of $1 billion $50 million. Now compare that below to what the government spent on air transport. It had an airport capital assistance program where it spent only $30 million. CATSA spent $560 million. That's $100 million less. And then there's subsidy for 18 airports that Transport Canada still owns. That came to about $40 million. So what you can do is you can see that $1.05 billion versus roughly $625 million. So in fact, the government, notice the picture in the lower left corner, the government is a cash cow here, $425 million. And as the Senate pointed out, do we want transport to be, a spark plug or a cash cow? The Emerson panel is echoing this, saying this is not right. Now, with airport governance, the current situation, it identifies a number of issues. First, as I've already indicated, onerous rents and taxes. Consumers face a high cost of travel. This is leading Canada to lose competitiveness. A second observation is airport ownership models worldwide have changed. Since the 1994 National Airports Policy, and indeed going earlier to the 1992 policy, elsewhere in the world, most airports now are being transferred into for-profit corporations with equity share capital. Outside the last bastion of socialism in the United States, where airports are still government-owned, the rest of the world, we see a private sector as the predominant model that's emerging, and he wants to get into that trend. He also points out that there are serious end-of-lease issues. He discusses them in the report. I'm happy to identify those for you if questions come up. And he also says that airports need substantial investments going forward if they're going to be cost competitive. Now, airport governance, we're going to talk first about the recommendations for large airports, and this is really radical here. privatization of large airports. Within 3 years, he is suggesting moving to an equity share capital structure for the larger airports. And by the way, in the little gray on the right, we give the page number reference to our points. These are page numbers in the review panel's report. Now, while he says he is recommending moving toward an equity base for large airports, he has no specific recommendation on how that governance model might look. He actually identified 5 potential privatization models. Some of these have dramatic changes. For example, one proposal would dissolve airport authorities, the large airport authorities, and then sell the assets to a consortium of investors. Other models are evolutionary. For example, he does talk about converting existing airport authorities into share capital companies, so less disruptive, but still a fundamental transformation. Some options he puts forward retain federal ownership of the land. Others would sell the land. So while he's making a radical recommendation of embracing private sector equity funding as part of the menu of financing the next 30 years of airport capital investments, he has no specific direction. So this is something in stage 2 of this process. Why privatization? He says that the current model has achieved its objectives, but this model now puts airport cost competitiveness at risk. And here's an important number. Canada has moved up and is now ranked number 16 in the world for airport infrastructure, but it's 135th for airport costs, and these numbers come from the World Economic Forum, and that's really disturbing. You know, we're down there with Burkina Faso and some other places there. The airport governance models have changed elsewhere in the world since 1992. I made that point. Governance practices also vary across the airport authorities in Canada, and some stakeholders have identified this as a problem, and so he's looking for a fairly major change in airport governance model. He wants to restore Canada to its place as a world leader for airport governance practices, and he wants to create a new source of financial capital for long-run investments. Privatization of large airports will require some regulation. He talks about light touch regulation. He says privatization, while it may be tempting to get the highest dollar value out of these private sector investors, he says that that is not necessarily what Canada should do. That'll simply raise costs, and the objective here is to get costs down. He says transfer of ownership from the federal government would also resolve the end of lease issues, airports gaining access to new capital funding, and he does have provision in there for public protection against insolvency. That's one of the reasons the major airports in Canada were leased rather than sold, because as leased facilities, if an airport authority went bankrupt, the Crown would be able to step in and take over and operate. He's going to have a similar provision in here. Now, for smaller airports, the recommendation is for the smaller NAS airports to be divested. Right now, airports such as Charlottetown and Gander are part of the National Airport System. They are leased, whereas other airports are local airport authorities that actually own the airport outright. And he's saying if the 5 smallest National Airport System airports wish to leave the National Airport System and become like local service and regional airports, they should be allowed to do that. And when they leave, there'll be a gift from the federal government for infrastructure and safety upgrades. This then leads to a recommendation to expand the airport's capital assistance programs. In part, if the airports like Gander and Charlottetown come into the eligibility for the Airport Capital Assistance Program, the funds will need to be expanded. Plus, he has a general recommendation that Canada needs to stop extracting money out of airports and instead put more money into the airport system, not just from user charges and taxes and rents from the aviation system, but also out of the general treasury. He has some comments about payments in lieu of taxes as well. We'll be happy to answer questions about that if you have them. Some other recommendations, one is phasing out of airport rents, although it's not clear what's really meant here. Did he mean phase out rents because we're now going to sell the airport to private investors, or did he mean phase out rents, period, and you can get your airport for $1? There's going to be a lot of discussion around this, I'm sure. Airport improvement fees, he is looking for some regulation around this. They need to be tied to specific projects with explicit sunset provisions. He talks in the report in several places about adopting the Australian model around airport improvement fees and generally airport fees and charges. In Australia, airport monitors price charges but doesn't actively regulate them. It undertakes 5-year comprehensive reviews, but it has legislative powers to step in and regulate airports if they get out of line. As well, if airlines are unhappy with fees and charges, they can seek an arbitration process in Australia, not unlike what's used here in Canada in the rail system. A question we have is he proposing an Airports Act? Those of us who've been in the industry will remember several nightmare versions of a potential Airports Act. I'm not sure that's what he has in mind here, but he does have a number of legislation points that could potentially be collected into an Airports Act. Light touch regulation, AIF, mandating airline experience on airport board of directors, more verbiage around airport consultation with its users, more data reporting, and some directive powers for the minister. Now, I'd like to change topics now to another aspect of aviation, which is he talks about a global hub strategy which have a number of facilitation issues. And I'm going to ask my colleague Solomon Wong, our expert in this area, to provide the comments there.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Shifting gears a little bit, one of the key directions to the review panel was to look at connectivity insofar as the ability for traffic to connect through Canada to other places. So from an aviation standpoint, in terms of the report that came out yesterday that was tabled, the global hub strategy is the key area to deal with the connectivity issues. And I think one of the things that is resounding on page 200 of volume 1 of the report is it cites the nature of Canada being a fairly small country, and in order to be able to actually have a range of greater destinations directly to airports in Canada, as well as offer a range of other choices for traders and travelers. Those are some of the things around connectivity that are quite important in terms of the context that has a number of recommendations, 6, 7, and 8, specifically around the area of facilitation. So key to this is looking ahead, trade being a fundamental economic driver for Canada. And in the last Canadian election, this was certainly a key platform for the current government around the nature of trade and also how things are evolving in terms of being able to look at where Trans-Pacific Partnership could generate additional trade opportunities when it's ratified. So in recognition of this, on page 199 to 200 is a section that talks about the way that higher volumes of travelers and freight will create those opportunities economically to generate additional jobs in other sectors. It cites the ability for transit traffic to grow airline volumes by 25 to 50%. And we do know that based on what some of the carriers are looking at in Canada, whether it's international carriers going into Canada, connecting to domestic carriers, this is of key importance for the market. Air Canada in November talked about a 1.5% target for 6th Freedom traffic to the United States. WestJet as well in its planning for expansion of international networks no doubt has some of that in mind as well. But key to this is also a recognition of looking at how the ability to keep pace with competing markets in Europe, in Asia. The goal stated in the review panel report is to bring Canada in line with other jurisdictions whose policies and programs enable fast and secure connections. And that's a fundamental area around how the global hub strategy is positioned, and the quotation that I pasted here from Air Canada on the nature of the mature market and some of the things that have shown the change in market share for connections, South America to Asia, for example, through Canada, and the same goes for the U.S. as well. The market share has dropped in view of what other areas in the world have done to grow that linkage and facilitation. So moving into Recommendation 7 from Chapter 9, this is a fundamental part of where policymaking could go to with the response to this report. The report articulates a four-legged stool for what will make Canada more effective. It's aligning tourism promotion, immigration border security facilitation, international trade, and air services negotiation, all in the same breath and coordinated. When this works, a good example of this is the UK. In 2013, a broad UK tourism strategy was outlined by the government, followed in 2014 by air bilateral changes with countries like China, followed by 2015 with 75 billion Canadian dollars of trade deals signed. And during this whole time, 2013, 14, 15, some fundamental changes were advanced by the UK government in visa facilitation, processes at airports, and building global hubs for the future. So following this Recommendation 6, I'm going in slightly a different order, but from a more detailed aspect, the Cta Review Report outlines the idea of increasing transit without visa for all airports except citizens from high-risk countries, being able to grow and expand automation and trusted traveler programs, moving and shifting away from visas to the recently introduced electronic travel authorization. And so some of those kinds of things, a lot of initiatives are already underway for implementation, but there's a bold vision around the kinds of things that could be advanced further. And we know, for example, with U.S. automated passport control, that there is a very decided move to automation for all nationalities, and those are some of the kinds of things with examples that could be looked at in terms of how to respond to the report in terms of consultations that will be forthcoming from the minister. On the security and regulatory side of things, one of the additional elements in terms of consensus with those who were consulted in the report was a sizable concern about how the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority is funded, regulated, and advanced in terms of service delivery. So the idea here in terms of the broad statement on the left-hand side, the report cites the reforms of how security screening is delivered and regulated could enable Canada to become a world leader in security, service, and value overall to improve competitiveness. I think the ability to actually recognize the leadership role that Canada has played goes a bit further into history, particularly after the tragedy of the Air India incident in 1985. But being able to actually look forward, taking the regulatory structure, the recommendation from the report is to replace CATSA with a single aviation security agency with both regulatory oversight and operations. This is specifically to the area of aviation security screening, and in terms of a model that is closest to what reflects the language in the report, is the areas where TSA has in the United States the ability to self-regulate certain areas associated with aviation security screening that do make it faster to actually get to operational change, and also the connectivity between risk assessment and actual service delivery. Second part, and one that has had a number of discussions in the past year around the customer service mandate and regulating performance standards. This is certainly an area that will be a topic of additional discussion around wait time for service, as well as how to deal more effectively with connecting passengers. Third point, and the graph on the left-hand side was also in the report in terms of outlining in the green bar. I know it's too small to read, but it's definitely worth reviewing around the forecast of air traveler security charge going into general revenues versus the bar graph that shows the amount that is spent. The ability to actually look at how this actually balances in terms of fees versus the changes in the user fee structure, those are certainly themes throughout the entire report. And lastly, looking at increasing and implementing intelligence-driven risk-based passenger screening and some of the themes around what risk-based security means in a country like Canada. And then lastly, and I think some of the things that may be a bit broader in terms of recommendations. Recommendation 10 talks a lot about the ability to strengthen how Canada leads in regulation, certification, risk analysis, and its role in ICAO. And there's certainly a lot of terminology used in the recommendations around making sure the framework meets the needs for risk assessment, and this could be a range of different things, including security, safety, privacy, and those kinds of things. Now, in terms of closing on this section before I turn it over to Mike, I think the key take-home is that four-legged stool around what hubs actually mean in aviation in terms of trade tourism, bilaterals matched with facilitation. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Solomon. So now we'll go on to the air access issues here. He's proposing a package of policy changes to increase air access for Canadian visitors and to enhance hubs. The basic premise, driving long-term recommendations on airline policy, we've got a quote there. The world is changing and moving inevitably toward a liberal open market for air services. It's time to reconsider policies that have served us well when the Canadian airline industry needed protection to flourish, but that impair competitiveness. Of course, such protectionism comes at a cost that's largely borne by Canadian consumers who pay relatively high airfares, and by the Canadian travel and tourism sector that, also due to high costs, has been losing market share for over a decade. With airline policy, there's sort of three main themes. The first is reducing costs, which largely focuses on airport issues and airport costs and the air travel security charge, both of which he's recommending reductions. There's the issue of access, which we'll get to in the next few slides. And then there's also user experience, which Solomon talked to some extent around facilitation issues. And he has another section about consumer protection that he would like to see legislated. We will not be covering that. On airline policy with respect to ownership, some interesting recommendations here. First, increase the limit on passenger carriers from 25% to 49%. This is essentially the norm outside of North America. A very interesting idea is to allow 100% foreign ownership of all cargo airlines. I suspect the concept may be if we do this, the FedEx and UPS could make major investments into the Canadian cargo carriers and perhaps develop global hub operations out of Canada. He also says that on the foreign ownership issues, the responsibility for assessing foreign ownership and control of an airline should be instead addressed not by the Minister of Transport, but rather by Industry Canada and the Competition Bureau. Industry Canada deals with foreign ownership questions in a range of economic sectors. When the Chinese wanted to buy potash mines in Canada, Investment Canada reviewed that and determined it was not in Canada's interest and denied that. That's the idea that he's putting forth here. He also has some questions, no recommendations, about how the Canada Transportation Agency looks at control of domestic airline. I think some of you are aware of the history around this, of airlines that were potential startups, and the agency kind of put the brakes on them around control, domestic ownership and control issues. And also to review and clarify and improve the financial fitness test for air carriers. Now, with respect to bilateral agreements, he's making a move that's going to be a bit closer to open skies. The motivation is that there's a concern that by opening up too quickly the largest global hub carriers, Canada risks, if we open our market too quickly, the global hub carriers, like Emirates, for example, Canada risks becoming a feeder at the end of a spoke rather than a competitive hub. So he acknowledges that concern. But he goes on to say, however, while Canada's restrictive international air access regime has generally benefited Canadian carriers, they've failed to prevent fast-growing international carriers from indirectly accessing several Canadian markets through nearby U.S. airports. And he cites Seattle as a specific example here. By this workaround, U.S. airports are benefiting from a restrictive Canadian air access policy. He points out that the world's moving toward an open market for air services. And then this was interesting. He says Canada's largest carriers are now among the fastest growing and most profitable in the world. And by the carrier's own representations to his review panel, their sound finances, renewed fleets, and aggressive strategic position and aggressive strategies positions them well for global competition. The starting point then for changes on airline policy is in bilaterals, say a minimum of 7 weekly frequencies, essentially daily service for every carrier in the market. Right now we have a number of bilaterals that will restrict the foreign carrier to only 3 flights a week, for example. It says everybody gets at least 7 weekly frequencies. Second, also increase those frequencies on a planned basis. So don't force airports, airlines, and so forth into a continual regime of any time they want to expand their capacity, Canada's got to negotiate a new treaty. Instead, put in a treaty, everybody gets daily service, and then perhaps 2 years later, everybody will get double daily service. So scheduled increases in ownership rights. He's got a section in there dealing with fair trade and competition clauses. I'm happy to talk about that in questions or offline. And this is very important, is when government develops negotiating positions, it should now give greater weight to trade policy objectives, tourism objectives for studying Canada, global markets action plan, and so forth. The negotiating position should have greater weight on the users of the system, not merely the carriers. The goal, the long-run goal he puts in place is he'd like to see Canada eventually move to open skies, and he's set a target of achieving open skies in no more than 10 years. He points out that when he looked and his panel looked at the successful global hubs, he said almost all of them are open access markets, and he is saying Canada needs to have that key success factor in place within 10 years. There's some hints here about whether Canada might move to a multilateral approach like Europe is attempting to use. An interesting aspect we observe, sometimes what's interesting in things like this is not what's said, but what's not said. There was no mention anywhere in the report about joint ventures. And of course, joint ventures are a major development in the industry. Air Canada, for example, is seeking a joint venture right now with Air China. There's a lot of advantages of these joint ventures. There's competition issues that have to be addressed, of course, and it was a little surprising to us that the report was completely silent on issues of alliances and joint ventures. Now, some of these next points we'll actually go through fairly quickly. On air navigation and control, essentially said Nav Canada has been successful, no recommendations. It's that simple on air navigation. Next, northern issues. So he has some recommendations here. He is proposing reforming the user pay policy for air transport to improve its cost competitiveness. Another more direct way of saying this is all that money that you take out of air transport, reduce the amount you take out of air transport. What you do take out, put it back in, and put even more money in out of the general treasury. This is a fundamental change from the policies that were put in place in Canada starting in the late 1980s and through the 1990s of extracting revenue out of air transport or transport more generally. He's now saying the time's come to put it back in, especially with respect to aviation. Work with the provinces to further improve cost competitiveness. He has some discussion around provincial fuel taxes. There's also some discussion around payments in lieu of taxes. He's recommending strengthening the Airport Capital Assistance Program. He's got general comments about increasing funding for ACAP, but he also has specific comments with respect to northern air services, including allowing northern airports to access ACAP not only for safety issues, but for issues of paving runways, because many of the airports in the north are gravel runways, and today's aircraft technology is not gravel runway friendly, as well as lengthening runways because the short takeoff aircraft are going to be coming out of the fleets in the coming 10, 20 years, and we have to get ready for that. He has some comments as well about aviation regulation and certification. We indicate where you can find that in the report. Maintain and improve access to air transport in the north. He's recommending finding means to strengthen the cooperation between northern airlines and southern airlines so that passengers in the north can buy a single ticket for a single trip, rather than right now in many cases you buy a ticket on a northern carrier and then you have to separately buy tickets for the southern carrier. There's a range of connection issues that come up because of that. There's also some policies around how the federal government itself buys services. You'd like to see some policies that will enhance the attractiveness of using northern air carriers when government purchases transportation. He has some regulatory issues there as well. Here's another real quick one. Passenger ferry transportation. Essentially said, it should be noted that Transport Canada has recently undertaken a separate review of federally regulated ferry and ferry services, so we're not going to say anything about that, and that's short and sweet. Now let me turn to marine transportation. 60% of Canada's GDP is tied to international trade. He makes this point with respect to both aviation as well as ports, but ports, of course, carry much larger portion of the heavy volumes of Canada's trade. He says Canada's geographic advantage for shipping cargo faster into the North American heartland from the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Essentially, we've got this global geographic advantage, but that will not be enough in and of itself to draw traffic to Prince Rupert and Vancouver on the west coast, and Halifax, Montreal, St. John, and so forth on the east coast. So he said, we can't rely on our geographic advantage. We have to do more. And again, he points out our rankings are falling. We've dropped from 14th to 21st place on Canada's in terms of port infrastructure. He notes the constraints on Canadian port authorities to invest. Port authorities, unlike airport authorities, are limited in how much money they can borrow. They're limited to whatever the transport minister will allow. In part, this is because the transport minister guarantees debts in some aspects for Canadian port authorities. Port authorities are actually agents of the Crown. That's not the case for airports. And port authorities are limited in how they can develop lands, generally not being allowed to develop lands for non-transport uses that might generate revenues. And so these factors constrain the larger port authority's ability to invest. So that's the motivation. So on port governance and capitalization, like airports, he's saying let's look at access for for-profit equity capital for the ports. But that's pretty much all he said. He has even less of a discussion of the different options and which options should be chosen. So he's saying, he's basically throwing a chip on the table, saying let's talk about equity capital for ports, and that discussion will come in phase 2. He recommends amalgamating regional ports. He does recommend, like airports, to introduce some regulation of fees and charges. He talks about light touch regulation a la Australia. And there's also issues about unfair competition. With respect to the agencies, he's recommending conferring on the agency oversight and enforcement in various port issues here. Regarding services and costs, sorry, this is not a Canadian photo, but we thought it was cute. He is recommending maintaining the user pay approach in terms of financing ports. He is recommending that user pay approach be subject to review by the agency. And like with airports, he has some recommendations about limiting payments in lieu of property taxes. A big section on promoting short sea shipping, say that 17 times. A lot of discussion around promoting this, including a few controversial issues. One is whether Canada would allow some degree of cabotage, for example, with U.S. Short sea carriers, Canada being able to provide such services between U.S. ports and U.S. carriers, potentially between Canadian ports. He has discussion around this. He has discussion around improving the finances by phasing out remaining duties on imported vessels. In Canada, our shipbuilding industry is smaller than it used to be, and vessels, for example, ferries, when they come into Canada, you actually have to pay duty on those, and he's suggesting phasing that out. And aligning regulations governing Canada-flagged shippers to put them on a competitive basis with international operators. So he'd like to see short sea shipping develop with Canadian operators, but we have to level the playing field. We have a lot of regulations that weigh against Canadian operators in this area. A lot of discussion as well around modernization of pilotage. Canada currently has 4 major pilotage authorities. He's got a proposal that has a lot of subtleties in it, but he's basically saying, let's create one national pilotage board, but then with 4 separate regional operations. He'd like to see a full assessment of this governance framework within 3 years, with compulsory review of pilotage areas every 3 to 5 years. Now, we have some discussion as well in here about the Coast Guard. I will not go into the details, but I would like to highlight for people, many people, even in Canada, don't recognize how different our Coast Guard is from the U.S. Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard has a very important enforcement role. they've got guns and cannons on their ships. That's not the case for Canada. The Canadian Coast Guard is not an enforcement agency. We're not enforcing poachers and smugglers and so forth. The Canadian Coast Guard is much more of a navigation and safety organization, and I think he's being subtle about what he's saying, but in the old days, the Coast Guard was part of Transport Canada. Now it's with Fisheries and Oceans, and Fisheries and Oceans has its own fleet for enforcement purposes, and he's saying this might not be the right fit to have the Coast Guard, which does not have an enforcement role, being part of a broader enforcement ministry. He's saying this is more about transportation safety, and maybe that belongs in Transport Canada, which has Canada's major safety orientation. So at this point then, this is our comments on the presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in through info@intervistas.ca. Please feel free to send questions, but I'll address a few that we have. One question that came in was, I keep referring to David Emerson and his report as opposed to the panel, and they wanted some clarification about that. The previous two reviews of Canada's Transportation Act were done by commissions, where all the commissioners acted collectively and voted together. This was different. The mandate given to this review panel is this was actually a mandate to one person, Dr. Emerson, and he was supported by an advisory panel of 5. But you'll actually see that the transmittal letter in this review report is only from the chair, Dr. Emerson. It's not signed by the entire panel. This is I would suggest, a personal view of Dr. Emerson with some very good advisors, but this is explained to me several times, a view about that. So I'm being asked to correct myself. Send questions to info@intervistas.com, not intervistas.ca. Okay, we'll have to Canadianize this in the future. Okay, here's another question here. I didn't see any commentary about the Billy Bishop Toronto City Centre Airport tripartite agreement. Does this mean that the CTA review will not directly help Porter Airlines' desire to operate the C-Series jets at YTZ, especially considering Minister Garneau publicly stating that he will not reopen the tripartite agreement? Just to confirm, at last week's Senate Standing Committee on Transport, this question came up, and Minister Garneau did reinforce that he does not intend to reopen the tripartite agreement. I confess I do not recall anything in the report specific to Billy Bishop Airport, either in the main report or in the appendix. We will take a look and follow up, Joel, on your question, but it appears that he viewed that this was not an aspect of the Canada Transportation Act that he was going to review. I suspect it does have to do with the complexity of that tripartite agreement, and we'll just have to leave it there. Now, can we unmute this? We had these two questions that came in by internet, and what we've done now is we've unmuted. So we're now able to listen to you if you have any questions. So if anyone else has questions, we're happy to answer them right now. Otherwise, you can feel free to contact us by email, and we'll follow up directly.
Hi, Mike. It's Mary Jane Bennett.
Hello, Mary Jane.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can tell me, based on the report, how you see bilaterals unfolding in the future. If you can give just a little bit more information than what's contained in the report.
Well, we're trying to comment about what's in the report because Dr. Emerson can't directly affect the negotiating position. The negotiating position is typically developed by the Minister of Transport and his or her staff, and then implemented by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So this will be phase 2 and 3. We'll have to see what Minister Garneau wishes to do. All we can say is that Dr. Emerson is advising the minister, your goal should be to get to open sky. That's where much of the rest of the world is moving. I think he's saying that while there are representations that the Blue Skies policy is almost like open skies, I do think the report makes fairly clear that he's not buying into that, and that he does see a tendency to interpret a few broad statements in the Blue Skies policy into some restrictive elements. He's got some specific recommendations saying, going forward, everybody gets a daily frequency. We're not going to say, well, Emirates, you only get 3, and Taiwanese carriers, you only get 3 or 4, as the case may be. He's saying everybody gets daily frequency. That's the standard in the world right now. But I'm not able to comment about whether the minister will adopt these recommendations right away and make some changes. Transport Canada, of course, has been active in negotiating a number of new agreements, and several of them, for example, China and Australia, have increased access for both Canadian and foreign carriers. And Australia is a good example because the carrier that's probably going to benefit the most of the increased access to Australia is Air Canada, because it's now adding Brisbane. It could do that under the old treaty, but now with the new treaty, it can actually go to a daily frequency in Brisbane, and it intends to do that.
Thank you.
Yep. Mary Jane is a former commissioner of the Canada Transportation Agency, by the way. So, any other comments or questions? Okay, well, we thank you all for your interest and attention. We do... Oh, sorry, there is one more question. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Jim McClanders at the Winnipeg Airports Authority. Any
Greetings.
greater sense of timing on the Phase 2 consultation piece?
Well, the minister... on the timing of consultations, the minister last week in front of the Senate said that he did intend to proceed directly into consultations. And he indicated in his remarks in the House yesterday that he intends to implement, at least what he wants to implement, by the end of this year. He wants to action this within 2016. So that's suggesting to me that he's likely going to go into consultations fairly quickly. We had heard some weeks earlier, right after the Emerson report was delivered. It was delivered just before Christmas, and there were a few comments being made immediately after that. At that time, the minister was saying that he was expecting to go into consultations probably in the late spring. So I would expect that we will hear something in the not-too-distant future, that there will be some kind of a road show, because there's hints that the minister's staff may actually go on a road show across Canada and start listening to people. So I would suggest that you have to start developing your arguments and hiring the best consultants in Canada as well on this. So you thought there'd be no advertisement here. There, I got it in. Okay, I do want to...
Could I ask one more follow-up? It's Jim again in Winnipeg. Here's a question for you. So if you were a betting person, the odds of going to a full for-profit model for airports?
What are the odds of Donald Trump being elected? I can say that I can make a few observations. First, it is a personal view of mine, not necessarily the company. I think the airports collectively left themselves open to this type of recommendation because the airports did not have a consensus position on the governance model. And that was essentially, you can think of it as divide and conquer. There were some airports that asked for this. Montreal in particular asked for this, and he's got a quote from Montreal in the report. Other airports clearly are opposing this. I think that the odds of going to something where we're going to take we're going to legislate and grab the airports away from the airport authorities and go out to tender to Macquarie's Bank on this, I'm not going to place a big bet on that because I think that there are a lot of vested interests who would not like to see that. And it strikes me as it could potentially raise the cost of air transport. How the equity is transferred and at what price is really unknown and important. I would not be surprised if there's going to be some flexibility here, like there'll be some investigation of this, and the question will be, should we allow this as an opt-in? Remember, our initial policy to create the local airport authorities was voluntary. The minister, at the time, I think it was John Crosby, actually, he said, if communities want to acquire their airports, give me a call. If not, we'll continue to operate them for you. So it started out on a voluntary basis. That's one possible way forward. If Montreal wants to do this, maybe we'll let that be done, and we can see how that works out and decide whether we're going to do the others. So I would place a very small bet on a dramatic equity thing politically. I'd place a larger bet on a voluntary policy, and I think this is for the airports and their stakeholders to discuss among themselves. You know, do you want to go this? I think he wants to stimulate that dialogue on this. Now, I've got another one here from Vince at Winnipeg. The feel of the report that it focus on airport security is mostly in regard to screening as opposed to airport security as a system, meaning that only part of the security process could be subject to change. Is this the case? So, Solomon.
Yeah, absolutely, Vince. One of the comments I did have reviewing this is, although the recommendation states airport security, all this report actually deals with is aviation security screening. And for those of you working more in aviation and airport security, we all know that that is one component, but not the only component of aviation security. But to be clear, that's all that's in this report.
Thanks. And I do mention that we actually have been recording the session. We'll cut the questions out, but we will be posting this webinar on our website so people who couldn't join. We know the CAC unfortunately had to schedule a board meeting to discuss the Emerson report at the same time as us, but you can tell your colleagues that we're actually going to put this on our website, and they can stream it through YouTube if they're interested in our presentations on the site. Any other questions? I can see we're still maintaining our attendance, so there seems to be some interest. Okay, if not, if something comes up, you have our phone number and our email addresses. You can get them on the website if you've forgotten. We thank you for your interest, and we hope to continue the dialogue with you. And everybody enjoy your weekend. Well, thank you and goodbye.